morning. Welcome to the Trent England Show. Glad to have you along for the morning here this Monday morning. It's pretty much all education. I've got to start off with a story you might not have seen, though. It's a great story. It's a feel-good story about penguins. Everybody loves penguins, right? About the Adelie penguin, which has been called, I actually have this book cover up on my screen here. I was just looking at this before we started the show this morning. The Adelie penguin has been called the bellwether of climate change. The bellwether of climate change. And new research shows that there are way more Adelie penguins than was believed. The numbers are, so up until last week, or whenever the reports came out last week, up until whenever this research was published, this was one of, you've got the polar bears at the North Pole and you've got the penguins at the South Pole, and especially the Adelie penguins were the bellwether of climate change. They were going to dwindle. They were going to go extinct if we didn't give Al Gore and his buddies all the power to control our lives. And now they say there are 1.5 more Adelie penguins than they ever knew about. Population numbers, at least as far as scientists have actually counted, population numbers are up. They're probably just constant. So there's your feel-good story for this Monday morning. Cute little Adelie penguins, more than scientists ever knew before, and these bellwethers of climate change seem to be doing just fine. One thing I'm not going to talk about, by the way, is the Oscars. I could care less. So if you're waiting for that, you're probably relieved. I hope you're relieved. I can't stomach that stuff. One thing we're waiting for this week is, you can't predict what the Oklahoma Supreme Court is going to do and when they're going to do it, but it is, I think, likely that this week we will get the ruling from the case that they heard last Thursday. And I don't know that I've seen a single report on this that gets it right, sadly. We do what we can here on the Trent England Show. This is the state question, the proposed state question that would add 5% to the gross production tax for wells in their first 3 years, right? And everybody says, what's the report here from Adam Wilmoth over at News OK? If approved by voters in November, State Question 795 would set the gross production tax on oil and natural gas at 7%, period. That sentence is almost right, but it's wrong because it adds 5%. Anyhow, I know I'm a stickler for actually getting these things right. But that case was heard on Thursday. It's actually two different challenges to that state question proposal. I would expect that the Oklahoma Supreme Court will rule this week, but again, there's no guarantee of that. They don't give you a warning ahead of time. But that is going to play a major role in determining the rest of the legislative session, because if the Oklahoma Supreme Court strikes down that ballot measure, or does something that delays that ballot measure and keeps it off of the ballot in November, then let's just be honest, that takes some of the pressure off of oil and gas interests in Oklahoma. They're very concerned not just about the tax, that's a major increase in taxes to go from 2% to 7%. They've already, this is why they have said, oh yeah, okay, take us to 4%. 4%'s no big deal, because they thought if they went to 4%, then they could take the wind out of the sails of this push for 7%. But they're also concerned because some of us have pointed out, I'm not the only person, but a number of us have pointed out to them, look, you could take it to 4%. This state question could still go to the ballot, and that's what they were saying during the big push for the big, massive step-up package of tax increases. The proponents of this state question were saying, we're going to take it to the ballot anyway. And if you go from 2 to 4 and then you add plus 5, you go to 9%, right? Which is why Adam Wilmoth, his write-up on this is so dangerously misleading, right? It actually leaves out a really important fact about all this. So if the Supreme Court does something to prevent this from going to the ballot in November, takes the pressure off of oil and gas interests in Oklahoma, takes the pressure off of the legislature to some degree, and I think that would significantly change the legislative session. On the other hand, what I think is somewhat more likely is that the court allows this to move forward. If the court allows this to move forward, they start gathering signatures, And that will, you know, as people watch that process happen, if they think this is going to be on the ballot in November, the polling at this point suggests that it would pass. Now, I still am surprised by people who get all wrapped up about polling this early on a tax measure when people don't know all the details. We saw what happened with the Dave Boren sales tax increase. The thing was a guaranteed, you know, it was the lock of the week. It was a guaranteed going to pass, and it got crushed by voters at the ballot because once voters focused in on that measure, once voters really found out what was in it, they were turned off by the fact that a lot of the money would go to things other than teacher pay, by the true cost of the tax increase, whatever it was. Voters did a major turnaround and voted that down. And there was, you know, there's not a huge campaign against it, by the way. There was a huge campaign for it, but not against it. So I'm a little bit surprised that people get so caught up in what the polls predict. But this will play a major role in the tone, tenor, and probably the outcome of the legislative session. Okay, let's get to schools. We're going to talk about education for the rest of the show this morning. There are a bunch of stories out there. A couple of them are really important. Some of them are really important if you have kids in public schools because there are stories about a potential statewide teacher strike. We're going to talk about that in a minute. It would be a colossal mistake for the interests who are pushing that, and for a lot of people, a lot of other people as well. But we'll get there in just a minute. Thanks to some good reporting, so now I'm going to give the Oklahoman some credit. Thanks to some good reporting, Randy Ellis has the story, investigative reporter for the Oklahoman. They have uncovered the fact that that Yukon schools came to a settlement with Cisco Corporation, which does food services in state schools, in state prisons. I don't know, maybe they do other things as well, but I know they do those two things. They actually had settled with the Department of Corrections in the past for overcharging for food, and now, lo and behold, turns out they were doing the same thing in Yukon. At least they paid Yukon $500,000. Well, they paid out, let's get this right, they paid out $500,000 to Yukon. Yukon said that they overcharged them by something north of $700,000 on food service over the course of 4 years. The $500,000 payment, of course, was split with the attorneys. So the school district got back, you know, what, a third of what they say they were overcharged. I just want to make one point about every story like this. Every time Oklahoma City Public Schools spends tens of thousands of dollars on a superintendent search, every time a school district pays off a disgraced superintendent who is leaving their post, every time a school district overpays for something, accepts a settlement that is less than what that school district has overpaid, in this case, for something, every time you see that, I mean, shouldn't we ask ourselves the question, where does this money come from? These school districts tell us they're strapped for cash. And remember, every dollar a school district spends on something like this in particular, this is not true without a law change of money they spend on buildings and computers most of the time. But when they spend money on food service, when they spend money on superintendent bonuses, every dime of that money is money that the school board could give to teachers. Every dime of that is money that the school board could spend on teacher salaries, teacher bonuses, you know, other things to incentivize teacher retention, could spend buying new textbooks, right? Every dollar they spend on superintendent recruiting efforts, superintendent bonuses, superintendent payoffs, every dollar they overpay for food services, right? I mean, shouldn't we sit back and say, wait a second, you tell us you're broke, and then you're overpaying $700,000 for food service in Yukon? I mean, again, where does the money come from? How can you be broke when you can waste money, right? Those two things don't go together. Okay, so that is the story out of Yukon. Teacher walkout threats. I want to say a couple things about this. One is I've got a fascinating pair of stories to tell you about this morning because these are both by Andrea Eager up at the Tulsa World. The first one is by Andrea Eager and Sam Hardiman. The second one is just by Andrea Eager. And they are so shocking. Actually, no, the second one is by Andrea Eager, Curtis Kilman, and Samuel Hardiman. Okay, so I always want to name the authors, for better or for worse. And I'm not knocking them because, I mean, both of these stories tell a good story. It's just that they conflict a little bit. So the first story about the teacher walkout is all about efforts to raise taxes and raise teacher pay. That's what it's all about. It's all about raising taxes, right? That they're so frustrated. Some of these people are so frustrated that they haven't raised taxes, that the step-up tax increase plan didn't pass, that other tax increase plans haven't passed. It's all about raising taxes, right? I pointed this out on Friday. None of these people ever talk about saving money. They never talk about running government more efficiently. They never talk about anything that's actually a more realistic, better way to raise money for teachers. It doesn't raise money for teachers and then tax teachers more, right? It doesn't raise money for teachers on the backs of their students' families, right? I mean, this is the common sense way to approach anything in government where you need money, is to first of all say, what money do we have there? What money do we have there that's not being spent on this is a high priority, so what do we have that's being spent on lower priorities? What do we have that's just being wasted? Are we overpaying for food service? Maybe they should ask that question in some other districts. Actually, the state auditor has suggested that other districts look into this. So the story is that the idea of a statewide teacher walkout is gaining traction online, and that there was a meeting and in all of this, and it trumpets the fact that a Facebook group in favor of a walkout has 52,000 members. Of course, those aren't necessarily people who support a walkout. They're not necessarily teachers. I'm sure a lot of them are don't fall into either one of those camps. I'm sure a lot of teachers are just very anxious to follow this whole debate. But look, who does a walkout hurt? A walkout hurts students, right? A walkout hurts students. A walkout hurts families. We've been being told in Oklahoma, and I don't buy into this 100%, as you know if you watch the show every day, but we've been told that the worst thing that ever happened to Oklahoma is that some districts are on a 4-day school week, which is a very small percentage of Oklahoma students that are on a 4-day school week, because mostly it's small school districts. But look, we've been told it is a travesty, it's a tragedy when kids aren't in school, when it's, during the week, during the school year, right? And so they're talking about shutting down. Now, I mean, obviously it's a political pressure tactic. Everybody understands that, but it's a political pressure tactic that hurts students. It also interferes with a lot of teachers who don't necessarily support walkouts. And I've seen this before. I've been in a district when a school district went on strike. I was a student in a district that went on strike. And it divides parents, it divides the community, it divides students. And what you see beforehand, now here's the clue. Here's the thing to understand, especially if you're watching me and you're thinking about, you're thinking this is a good idea. Here's what most people fail to understand about efforts like this. Beforehand, the people who agitate are all in favor of a strike. It doesn't mean everybody's in favor of the strike. It's always a minority. It's always a minority of people who are agitating for anything, right? Who are actually out walking the streets or whatever, agitating on social media. That's not to say whether they represent a majority or a minority, right? But you always have a minority of people who are driving an effort like this. And most people are sort of tuned out. They think it's not really going to happen. Maybe they just don't watch the news. There are a lot of people like that, right? And then it happens, and then all of a sudden, everyone is forced to confront the fact that it's happening, and all of a sudden you have opposition, right? It may seem like, well, everybody's either for it or they're neutral before it happens, but once it happens, you have a bunch of people who are for it, you have a bunch of people who are against it. That will be true among teachers, it'll be true among students, it'll be true among parents. It will create opposition that isn't already there. I mean, that's sort of my free pro tip for people who are agitating in this direction. But the other thing to confront here, and I a little bit feel like a broken record, and I feel like I'm doing these people's job for them, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. The other story here by Andrea Eager, Curtis Kilman, Samuel Hardiman in the Tulsa World yesterday says Tulsa Public Schools loses 35% of its teachers in 2 years, but many aren't leaving for higher pay. And I'm going to post this story later. I'll post all these stories later, of course, but I'm going to post this story later. I might write something up to really call out some of the points in this story. It shows exactly what I showed years ago when I went up and interviewed teachers at one of the rallies at the Capitol. So it was, I don't know, 2-3 years ago. I went and I interviewed teachers who were rallying at the Capitol ostensibly for tax increases. I just asked them some simple questions. What is it you're here to, what is it you want? I guess that was the simplest question. What is it you want? What are you here asking for? Not a leading question. People didn't know, where I came from on the whole issue. And over and over and over again, I had teachers say things like, I had one say, well, we were told to talk about pay, but what I'm really concerned about is all the testing. And other teachers say, you know, what it really is all the testing. What it really is all the mandates. I had several people say, you know, it's really just, I just have this sense that people don't value what we do and that we're not supported in the classroom. And you know what this story says? This story says it's about mandates. It's about disrespect. This story focuses in on the leadership of the Tulsa School District and shows a lot of teachers leaving Tulsa Public Schools not to get out of teaching, but to get out of Tulsa, to get out of that school district, to get away from those administrators who they feel like don't support teachers, which the story points out, and this is absolutely true, is a common story in urban school districts, where school leaders oftentimes discover that it's a lot easier to make teachers the bad guy, and rather than support teachers trying to discipline students in an unruly environment. And of course, if you can't master the unruly environment, you can't really teach, and students can't really learn, and you're not going to succeed. But look, that's from the standpoint of a lot of lazy administrators, that's the teacher's problem in the classroom. They can figure it out, and if they don't figure it out, the last thing an administrator wants is that teacher sending students down to the principal's office or getting the superintendent or some assistant superintendent involved, right? That makes those people's jobs harder. That makes their lives more difficult. That forces them to make decisions in which probably almost nobody's going to be happy. And I have seen this play out. I have heard this. I went to an urban high school. I have a relative who taught in an urban high school. I've seen this play out time after time. Nothing in the Tulsa World story is surprising, except for this one fact. It's not about the money. This is exactly what the headline says. It's not about the money for lots and lots and lots of teachers, which ought to tell state legislators and the rest of us a couple of things. One is you can raise teacher pay and you're still going to have a teacher retention problem in Oklahoma. And the second is, because you're still going to have a teacher retention problem in Oklahoma, you're still going to have people who use teachers as hostages in their bargaining for bigger government. And we know right now, I mean, everybody knows, and even people who support higher taxes should be honest enough to acknowledge that teacher pay is simply the most saleable piece of that package, right? They don't just want a teacher pay raise. David Warren, I mean, frankly, his tax increase got smoked at the polls because people realized it was about a whole bunch of other things. It was about funding administration. It was about funding bloated salaries in higher education. It was about all kinds of things. In addition to teacher pay, they put the teacher pay in there because they thought they could trick people into passing a big tax increase when only about 60% of it went to teacher pay. So look, the people who think that passing some big tax increase and raising teacher pay is going to end this debate aren't paying attention. And they should be paying attention to this story that was in the Tulsa World yesterday. What do we do? What do we do about it? We've talked about it here on the program. One of the things that needs to happen in Oklahoma is that the accountability needs to come back to local school boards, and people need to stop asking for salvation from their politicians in Oklahoma City and start focusing on the politicians that they elect in local school districts. There's a lot that the legislature could do to make that accountability, make that authority clear so that there is accountability in local school districts. We'll talk more about some of that later. I mean, the other thing that needs to be done on future programs, I mean, there's a lot that needs to happen to make our schools better places to teach. And paying teachers better is, you know, that would be a good start. I'm not saying it wouldn't. But one of the things that needs to happen is teachers need to be treated like professionals. And the other thing that you hear if you know teachers really well, and if they're really honest, and if they're good teachers, all those three things have to happen. And then you'll hear things like, well, you know, I really wish we had an environment where we were treated like professionals, right? Where you didn't have to suffer fools as you do in many schools. And I mean, look, I'll just throw this story out there. Former Kingston teacher facing rape charges. One of the things that you hear about schools all the time is that you can never get rid of a teacher unless they break the law. And I don't want to pick on any particular school. I just throw this story out there because, look, the school district got rid of this teacher once she was being investigated for sex crimes, right? I mean, that is in many school districts what it takes. And in some school districts, apparently, like Bixby, Even that is, even then the school superintendent who was covering up those things, not committing them himself, but covering up those things, got bonuses and got to wait it out until he qualified for his pension before he wasn't even let go, he was allowed to resign. Right? I mean, one of the best things that we could do for our schools is to professionalize teaching, which would mean, by the way, making it easier for principals and schools and school districts to hire and fire teachers, make it easy for them to pay teachers based on performance, to reward good performance. Until we do those things, we're not treating teachers as professionals. And all the union garbage out there that claims that, well, treating teachers as professionals means paying them for how long they've been in the classroom, all that is obviously wrong. And wrong to the point of being silly. One final story. Okay, so we have the story in the Tulsa World from yesterday about the fact that they're losing teachers because because a lot of teachers believe that they're not respected, not supported by district leadership in Tulsa Public Schools. How's the Tulsa Public Schools responding? Well, today we find out, again in the Tulsa World, seems like all our stories today are from the Tulsa World, we find out that what are they doing in Tulsa? They're renaming schools. They're even considering renaming a school that's named after Henry Ford, who, by the way, there are some notorious aspects of Henry Ford's character and his views. But look, the guy is part of, he's one of the most important Americans of the 20th century in business and industry. And I'm just always shocked at the cowardice of people who can't deal with historical legacies that aren't able to be whitewashed entirely, right? Look, Henry Ford, you ought to, at a school named after Henry Ford, you would hope that the students would know something about Henry Ford and would know the good and the bad. But the fact that they're talking about changing the name of even that school, I don't know. It goes to the, it's the smokescreen, it's the distraction. They don't want to deal with the real problems, so they deal with things like this. I'm going to leave it there for the Trent England Show. I will mention, I told you on Thursday, on Friday, that we were going to put up a list of criminal justice reform bills that are in the legislature. That is up at ocpathink.org, so you can go to ocpathink.org. You can find that, it's a blog post, it's got a list, the bills that carried over from last session, the bills that are new this session. I think everything in the list is still alive as of the cutoff. We posted it on cutoff day last Thursday, but you can go and you can find that list of bills and find out what's going on in the legislature with regard to criminal justice reform. I'll post all of the stories that I talked about, even the Adelie Penguins. I will post all of those stories up after we wrap up the show here in just a moment. This has been the Trent England Show for Monday morning. We're going to be around all week. Please share, subscribe on iTunes, and thanks for watching.